Time that morning where we take a look at what's making the headlines around the world in the newspapers, and joined by South African journalist Heather Walker. Good morning, Heather. Where shall we start?
Well, I thought we should start with This Day newspaper.
Which we should point out is Nigeria's favourite daily.
Absolutely. The story we have today is only a week after we saw General Buhari inaugurated as president. His party is experiencing some difficulties electing the people representing them in the National Assembly. It's quite a complicated story.
I was going to say, I read this and I was going, is this a little bit different from how we do things in the UK, even SA, a lot of other countries?
I think it seems like quite a complicated process that they have to go through to get a consensus on who they want.
Who's going into key positions.
Exactly. So the key positions they're looking at seems to be the Speaker and the Senate President. I'm not entirely sure how the Senate President fits into all of it. Obviously, we know about the Speaker in the UK and South Africa. It's the same. But essentially, there seems to have been some disagreement over who to represent them. There's been a mock election. They couldn't reach a consensus.
It seems odd that even in a mock election they couldn't even come up with an answer here.
Yeah, it's a rather crazy situation.
And there's some the PDP might be able to play some determining role in all of this.
Yeah, I couldn't once again work out how much influence they would have over the decision. But it does seem like in the Nigerian political system there is that option for other parties to have a stake in the say. So in the meantime, they seem to have elected a compromise speaker until they can work out who's going to. There seems to be some sort of factions in the party, which doesn't augur well for a party already, in very early days of leadership. Perhaps it's
a bit of empire
teething,
building within.
Yeah, or just some teething problems to start off with.
Of course, President Buhari managed to upset a few people by kind of not listening to various election. Well, not so much promises, but the idea of certain people going into certain roles, that seems to have sort of fallen by the wayside. I'm sure we'll find more about this over the next few days. Where should we go next?
Well, I thought a story in the Observer, the UK newspaper, was quite interesting. The headline is Poland warns Cameron not to fool voters over EU poll. Now, obviously, with the UK election very recently passed, and the promises of an EU, whether to stay in the EU, a referendum having been made by David Cameron, the Prime Minister, we're now seeing a lot of emotional reaction to that from all sides, and obviously there are various parties in the EU who are quite concerned about keeping the UK within the EU. For example, Angela Merkel from Germany, although she has said that she's been very sympathetic to the UK's reasons for wanting to leave. And
she's even talking about the possibility, she's sort of considering the possibility of actually changing treaties, which would require a huge amount of effort from across all the member states.
It definitely shows how much these people are bending over backwards to try and
except Francois Hollande, who is hell-bent on not doing anything particular to sort of help. But it's interesting that Poland is now one of the proponents of, you mustn't change, it's not fair if you kind of move the goalposts.
Yeah, well, I suppose Poland has been almost a key target when it comes to things like immigration policies in the UK. For example, saying that, people can't claim benefits until they've been here for 5 years, and Poland's minister in charge of EU policy is now sort of saying, well, you can't just give people half the reasons and not give them the full story as, the reasons for and against.
But it's not an even playing field, is it? Because the benefit system in the UK is particularly generous, and if it was generous elsewhere, then I'm sure we would all be flooding to other parts of the EU to benefit from it.
Well, the fact is that there are Brits benefiting from a number of issues that the EU gives them an advantage.
To go live in Spain and
work,
enjoy the weather.
Own property, etc. And this is one of the things that this minister is saying.
Slightly odd that Polish generally contribute more to the UK economy than they draw from it.
Yeah.
And more often than
generally
not, they
they're
will work.
Younger. They don't come here to necessarily study. They come here to work, pay taxes, and they're not necessarily draining the NHS or anything like that. So in many ways, as we've seen studies recently come out saying that immigrants from Eastern Europe, places like Poland, are actually contributing a vast amount to the UK.
Interesting that it's Poland being one of the silent voices there. Let's move on. We've got a couple of minutes left.
Well, yeah, on a related story, I thought it would be nice to talk about the Times of India, which is, says that Scotland is planning post-study work visas for Indians. Now, of course, not only Indians, but this was, from an Indian newspaper looking at it from that perspective. Now, interestingly, Scotland is working on plans to overrule the British Parliament, if necessary, to introduce a special visa to allow foreigners to work for 2 years after finishing their education. That visa was scrapped a while back, the Tier 1 visa, and they want to bring that back in.
This is going to just blow the immigration system in the UK completely apart,
Yeah.
because a bit like having the Schengen system within the whole of Europe, once you're in one bit, you can move around. It's going to be very difficult for, surely, Scotland to be able to issue its own visas, and then people can just sort of drift around the rest of the UK and even into the Republic of Ireland.
Yes, well, I think this plays into the whole complicated EU referendum, because if the EU referendum does take place, Scotland can then argue, well, actually, the circumstances under which we undertook our referendum have changed, so we can arguably now take another independence referendum, and if so, then they're free to pass any laws such as this that they want.
And we might have Hadrian's Wall sort of being rebuilt. Who knows?
Yeah.
One more, I think we've got time for one more paper.
All right. From the same newspaper, there's this Maggie Gate, let's call it.
Maggie,
Maggie
who knows how it's
noodles.
pronounced?
It's Maggie. It's Italian.
Okay.
Don't know why it's Italian, but it's from Nestle. But anyway, I think it's meant to sound Italian. I didn't realise noodles were so popular in India.
I have to say I was surprised.
I mean, you'd
Instant
think
noodles.
of rice in India. I know it's a stereotype, but you somehow don't think of noodles. But they're apparently incredibly popular. And the fact that there are now these concerns over lead and also
Monosodium
MSG.
glutamate.
And India says it's actually going to sue Maggie for
it
providing
must be,
unsafe products.
If they're having to be withdrawn from the shelf, it's going to hit Nestle and Maggie where it hurts.
Yeah.
And of course, it's a huge country to withdraw that number of products from.
Yeah, it's going to be quite a mission to get all those things off the shelves. And I think we saw a video package earlier on saying, how the shop owners are really feeling it themselves because
Sure they
they aren't able to sell the products.
Heather Walker, thank you for taking us through the papers.